Well, given the circumstances, I think there's only one true way to start this video off. For all of you who've been around since the beginning, this one's for you. Geez, we've come a long way since that. To those unfamiliar, that there was a recreation of my original video intro, first used a full decade ago as of this month. I had been doing videos here and there before then, but I was kinda just doing whatever I felt like, with no real consistent type of video content per se. But then at some point in 2010 or 2011, I stumbled across this small community of YouTubers around my age who were doing these videos known as countdowns. Eventually, I got to a point where I wanted to give it a go myself, and thus, in December of 2011, I put out 3 countdowns: Top 10 Worst Video Game Villains, Top 10 Fighting Game Finishers, and Top 10 Greatest Final Battles. Now sadly these videos don't exist anymore, as I deleted a bunch of my older work years ago, assuming no one was going to miss them. I have since learned that that wasn't the case, and I unfortunately lost those original files, so they're fully gone. But yeah, they did play a huge influence on where I ended up going, not just with my YouTube video content, but in ways, with my life. Doing these videos granted me the chance to experience things I probably never would have experienced otherwise, from conventions to collaborations to being inspired to pursue that game developer dream of mine. And that's not even mentioning the friendships I have nowadays because of all this. And now, here we are, 10 years since those videos that first got the ball rolling. That's crazy to think about, to be honest. Like, to put things into perspective, we were still in the PS3, Xbox 360, Wii era of gaming when I started countdowns. And saying that made me feel ridiculously old. Why did I do that? But anyway, as for how to celebrate this momentous occasion, I could have gone the route of something like top 10 favorite videos I've made, but I decided to do something a bit different. And by different, I mean stick to what I know and talk about boss fights. It's been no secret over the last decade that I love me a good boss fight, given just how many lists I'd done on the topic. But a straightforward favorite boss battles list with no extra theming of sorts, I haven't done that topic since 2012, and I've played a lot of games with a lot of great bosses since then. So to celebrate 10 years of me doing these silly gaming videos, I'm gonna up the ante and give you all my top 20 favorite boss battles. Now granted, I will be sticking with the age-old one per franchise rule, more so because trying to determine your favorites when factoring in multiple candidates from the same franchise is a lot harder than you may think, but that's really the only rule. First bosses, final bosses, super bosses, any type of boss fight is viable for this list. Though given that, I will be dabbling into spoilers here and there. I'll give a heads up when those moments occur though, just in case. With all that said and done, screw it for old time's sake, let us commence!
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So to start things off, we're actually going to be going into very recent game territory. As in, a game that came out earlier this year. I did a full review of Kaze and the Wild Masks back in April, but in short, it's a really fun 2D platformer that takes great amounts of inspiration from the 90s era of 2D platformers, most notably from my favorite platformer series of that era, Donkey Kong Country, so I may have a bit of bias in that regard. But even still, it's a very well-crafted indie game that seems to have gotten itself a small following, so I'm certainly really happy for the devs in that regard. One thing that the game does have over a lot of platformers from that era though, is the quality of its boss fights. There were exceptions of course, as we'll go into later, but bosses in that period of platformers tended to be just kinda there. Kaze doesn't fall into that same pitfall though, as its bosses are all quite engaging and often have a fair bit going on within them. And the best example of that in my opinion is the game's third boss, Olaf. Now the game has itself an animal transformation system, where you're given gameplay sections with slightly altered mechanics and level design to accommodate for the animal in question, and these carry over into some of the boss fights. In Olaf's case, you're using the Tiger Mask, which turns the game from Donkey Kong Country to Mega Man X, with the use of a dash and a wall jump, and this fight really tests your use of those two abilities. Olaf technically only has one attack, that being spawning these giant muncher plant things, but they can emerge from just about everywhere in the arena, and with the arena itself shifting after after each hit dealt, quick reflexes will be a very useful skill in surviving this. The fight may be simple in concept, but the execution carries that concept into feeling much meatier, especially given that Olaf's no pushover. But with only a max of 2 hit points before having to go back to the beginning of the fight, the room for error ain't too big. All worth it to bop the giant onion man on the head 3 times and cause him to explode as a result. Oh, video games.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
Oh hey, 2 entries in and we're already entering spoiler territory. Alright, let me quickly just... There we go. And yes, I know this game's nearly a decade old as well, but still, better safe than sorry. Anyway, Rhythm Thief. A game oozing with style, catchy music, and some utterly bonkers story beats. I mean, the whole plot is about an underground organization resurrecting Napoleon Bonaparte. So we've already got some outlandish stuff going on in this game. But that's nothing compared to your main character getting shot at point blank, an injury so critical that he collapses to the ground as a result, only to reveal it was practically just a scratch after he's made his escape. This game is ridiculous. And all this was caused by Jean-Francois, a formerly presumed ally, being the caretaker of your friend Marie, only to reveal in this moment to actually be part of the Napoleon Resurrection Club. He plays second in command to Napoleon throughout the game after that, so it's pretty evident that you're gonna get a chance to take him down. And sure enough, once on the floating city that's capable of creating world-destroying storms, this game is ridiculous, you get confronted by the backstabber on your way to Napoleon. And hey, we're already borrowing from Sonic with the whole floating city called Babylon Garden. Why not borrow one of Eggman's machines in the process?
Would you like to see what this weapon can do, Phantom Arm?
So if you want to be technical, this isn't a traditional boss fight, as there isn't a set number of hit points to deplete or anything like that. You just treat it like any other rhythm game and get yourself to the end with a high enough letter rank to complete the level. But hey, the rhythm game in question does involve reflecting Jean-Francois' attacks back at him, so I think we can count it. And that said, what a fight it is. Now granted, it is pretty easy compared to some of the levels beforehand, as all Jean-Francois does is shoot out these projectiles for you to punch back at him. I just thought about the fact that Phantom Arm is punching these energy crystals. Between this and the gunshot wound, I'm starting to wonder what Phantom Arm's body is made of. But yeah, simple as it is a pretty fun fight, all being accompanied by some great music. Seriously, whoever on the composing team decided to make a rock remix of Bach's Fugue in G minor was a genius. Though speaking of audio, my little nod to the Egg Emperor actually doesn't stop at just the design of Jean-Francois' weapon. He seems to have inherited Eggman's speech patterns too.
Eat this! Eat this!
And here I thought the levels based on Samba de Amigo and Space Channel 5 were going to be the deepest cuts this game makes to older Sega games. Guess I was wrong.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
Actually, while we're on the topic of older Sega games, how's about we talk about one of them? Now, like with Kaze, I already did a review video on Rystar earlier this year, but hey, I'm not going to complain about having another opportunity to show off this charming little Genesis gem, or Gemesis if you feel so inclined. You ever just regret saying something the moment it leaves your mouth? But yeah, Rystar is another solid 2D platformer, and happens to be one of those exceptions I brought up earlier about boss fights in that era of platformer. Not to say its bosses are going to blow everyone away or something, but they do tend to have a bit more meat on their bones more often than not. And unlike with Kaze, Rystar saved its best for last. Now let's get the obvious point out of the way. The final battle against Kaiser Greedy is hard. Not that Rystar is an overall easy game, but even compared to much of the rest of the game, this fight's hard. From the quick moving enemies with small projectile attacks in the first phase, to Kaiser Greedy zipping around and teleporting in the second phase, to, well, everything in the third phase, this battle really emphasizes the putting you to the test aspect of a boss fight, let alone a final one. But unlike with some of the other previous difficulty spikes, it's not a frustrating hard in my opinion. Sure, I've lost many a life to Kaiser Greedy's attacks, but I wouldn't say there's anything in the fight that feels outright cheap. But another key aspect in the battle's favor is its visual storytelling. Kaiser Greedy is a character you've seen very little of throughout the game, only showing up in the game's opening cutscene prior to this point, so you really don't know much about him going in. But within this single fight, you get a very clear picture painted of just the kind of tyrant he is, solely off his body language throughout the phases, lounging about and throwing in minions to take care of you in the first phase, keeping himself cloaked and using low energy attacks in the second phase, and finally uncovering himself while resorting to blasts of lightning and summoning insta-kill black holes during the third phase, showing just how much of a threat you've proven yourself to be in that short span of time. He's taking you seriously now, and he's gonna give it his all to make sure you can't stop him. And all this is accompanied with a wonderfully really intense boss theme that very cleverly has its escalation point timed so that, more often than not, you'll be entering the more insane third phase once the song's picked up its pace. Seriously, that's a great touch. But yeah, the Kaiser Greedy fight makes for a really good way to end off a really good game that unfortunately will likely not see a follow-up. Please prove me wrong on that last point, Sega.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to take my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So some of you may remember that a few years back, I did a list on my least favorite final bosses. Some elements of the video haven't quite held up, but one aspect that I still stand by is just how much of an utter letdown the final battle of Street Fighter V's story mode was. A one-on-one showdown between Ryu and a supposedly all-powerful M. Bison, and it's a simple one-round fight that was actually easier than some of the fights right before it. It was really disappointing to say the least. The reason I bring this up is because just a year after Capcom dropped the ball in wrapping up their fighting game story mode, Bandai Namco swooped in and proceeded to show off how to really pull off a final battle in a fighting game story mode. Oh, actually, on that note, now admittedly, I found Tekken 7 story mode overall just kind of okay. It felt pretty rushed at points, and I really didn't care for that new journalist narrator guy as the story's protagonist. That said, it more than made up for it with its finale, a one-on-one fight between Heihachi and his son Kazuya. Their choice of battlefield? Why, an active volcano, of course! It's Mishima family tradition to fight in areas with easy access to cliffs, after all. Now mechanically, the fight between Heihachi and Kazuya actually doesn't do anything particularly special. It plays like the usual Tekken 7 fight. But what this battle's got going for itself is the sense of grandiose and spectacle. While Street Fighter V's final battle just stuck to a one-round fight and called it a day, Tekken 7's final battle is a 4-phase beatdown. And while it plays standardly, it still does quite a lot to make it feel like so much more. From flashback cut-ins to past Tekken games as the fighter's health bars reach certain points, to Kazuya continuously upping his strength in each phase before finally going all out and transforming into his devil form, completely changing the tactics and abilities of your opponent, to the final phase requiring you to take down Devil Kazuya with only a fraction of your full health. And that's all before mentioning the music that goes along with it. The music does change throughout the phases, but the song that plays during the first two phases I can only describe as hype. It's no wonder it ended up in Smash Ultimate when Kazuya joined the roster. And it all culminates in a final blow-for-blow between the two, complete with flashbacks to the past Tekken games and their cutscenes, yes, even the janky PS1 FMVs, before Victor finally emerges. And, in classic Mishima tradition, the loser is thrown off a cliff, this time directly into molten lava. Really trying to emphasize that this is Heihachi's actual death, eh? Yeah, I give it 2 games before he comes back. This whole fight is practically a love letter to the legacy of Tekken and the ongoing story of the Mishima family, and it made for a great way to, supposedly, bring Kazuya and Heihachi's lifelong feud to an end. Though Kazuya ain't out of the woods just yet. He's still got a son after him.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to take my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So while Capcom may not be the best at wrapping up a fighting game story mode, they do easily make up for that in the boss fights they've got in some of their other franchises. And one franchise of theirs that pretty much lives and breathes off its bosses, well, aside from Monster Hunter, is Mega Man. The Mega Man series is filled to the brim with memorable bosses, and as such, picking a favorite could prove to be challenging to do. Well, maybe not. Depends on if you've got personal bias to a specific sub-series. In my case, I do, specifically to Mega Man X. Now granted, I wouldn't say I'm nearly as hyper-fixated on it nowadays as I was when I decided to name my channel Maverick Hunter 075, but I do still like the Mega Man X games, with Mega Man X4 being my personal favorite. Getting to fully play as Zero is an absolute blast, speaking as someone who generally prefers hack and slashing over run and gunning. And its lineup of Maverick bosses is up there as one of the strongest across the whole series, and I'm gonna stop beating around the bush, I'm going with Magma Dragoon. I know, not the most original choice, but hey, he's the fan favorite for a reason. For one, he has far more story involvement than any of the other stage Maverick bosses in the game, being a former Maverick Hunter and the one who caused the Sky Lagoon to crash down and essentially jumpstart the conflict between the Maverick Hunters and Repliforce. Granted, yes, he did this under orders from Sigma, but hey, it's still something. And then you get to confront him after traversing one of X4's best stages, that being an active volcano. I'm starting to sense a pattern here. And then the fight starts, and you quickly realize that Magma Dragoon isn't wearing Akuma's bead necklace for show. The guy's a living Street Fighter reference, using Hadoukens and Shoryukens as his means of attack, and even calling them out by name. But don't assume that's where his arsenal ends, as he's got himself some fire breath that covers the whole arena, a shot that can summon a pillar of lava, and he can also call down a full-blown meteor shower. That said though, you've actually got yourself some options as well, as this is one of the only boss fights in the whole series that you can take the ride armor into, giving you another means to battle the beast. It makes for an incredibly fun fight to say the least, and the weapons you're granted from slaying him make it all the more worth it. Zero's in particular, the Ryu Engine, has become a trademark part of his moveset in many of his future appearances. A solid reward for a solid boss from a solid game. What's more to say, really?
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So I imagine this next segment's gonna be a bit interesting, given the game we're about to focus on. Specifically because it's a game that I don't really like all that much. One that I get why people love as much as they do, don't get me wrong, but one that didn't really click with me in the grand scheme of things. With that said, let's talk about Shadow of the Colossus. One thing that I do really admire about this game is its sense of scale. All throughout, you feel small, both in regards to the environment and the colossi you have to take down. It makes slaying the majestic beasts feel like a true feat, even for the ones that you may not like fighting as much. And for a game that's 90 to 95% boss fights, you're bound to find at least one that you enjoy, even if you don't like the game overall. In my case, there were actually a handful that I enjoyed fighting, but my favorite Colossus fight in the game just so happens to capture its sense of scale in a different manner. While it may not be as big as some of the other Colossi you fought up to this point, or will end up fighting further on, the fifth Colossus, known by fans as Avion, certainly stands out for me. You start the fight landlocked atop a giant lake, but once you fire your arrows at the big bird and jump onto it as it swoops down toward you, you're quickly taken up high above the lake, and it's utterly exhilarating. And the way the music kicks in as Avion flies up, this is the kind of stuff that Shadow of the Colossus excels at the best. From there, you find yourself climbing around Avion's body, looking for and stabbing its weak spots, all while holding on for dear life while it soars around the area at high speed, barrel rolling and flapping around to try and shake you off. And hey, even if you do fall, you've got yourself a lake to land in, giving you a chance to swim back and try again. And I know I mentioned the music earlier, but man, that music. Avion's boss theme, A Despair-Filled Farewell, is easily my favorite song in the game's soundtrack, which is saying a lot given how fantastic the soundtrack overall is. It all makes for an incredible battle with a rather bittersweet conclusion. Shadow of the Colossus plays around with this whole idea of making you feel bad about killing these colossi, given how many of them only attack in self-defense. And while I can't say I quite felt that way with most of the bosses, Avion was one of the exceptions for me. The way it gracefully plummets into the lake, I couldn't help but feel a bit bad for having to kill such a wonderful creature. Okay, you win this round, game.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
And now for a bit of tonal whiplash. Let's go from a dreary tone game about slaying giant innocent creatures to funny monkeys and pirate crocodiles. For as much as I love the Donkey Kong Country games, one element that it doesn't really excel in all that much is boss fights. That whole thing I said about boss fights in 90s 2D platformers often being just kinda there, DKC is a prime example of that. Not that their bosses are bad most of the time, but many of them are pretty unremarkable. Heck, all of DKC 1's bosses are either just larger variants of regular enemies, or an oil drum that just summons regular enemies. DKC 2 does up the ante a bit, but overall, the boss lineup is still just kind of alright, nothing too special. With one very notable exception. Just like how the Kremlin crew's leader, King K. Rool, made for the best boss in DKC 1, his grand return in DKC 2, now under the moniker of Captain K. Rool, made for the best boss in DKC 2. And while in DKC 1 you were just fighting to get your banana horde back, this time around you're fighting to save DK's very life from the cruel captain. And believe me when I say, he puts up quite the fight against Diddy and Dixie. Armed with a massive blunderbuss, Captain K. Rool is capable of firing cannonballs aplenty, both of the spiked and non-spiked variety, the latter of which you'll want to throw back into his blunderbuss when he tries to suck you closer to it. But his cannonball shots can also take many different movement patterns, and that's before mentioning his blunderbuss's other capabilities, such as allowing him to rocket back and forth across the arena, and in the final phase, shoot out poison gases that can freeze you in place, slow you down, or even reverse your D-pad inputs. Oh yeah, K. Rool's not pulling any punches, and if you're not careful, he'll be quick to knock you out, potentially even unintentionally. It can definitely be a tough hurdle to overcome if you're not prepared, but man if it ain't a thrilling challenge. challenge. And while yes, Gangplank Galleon from DKC1 is an iconic final boss theme, it's got nothing on the even more intense Crocodile Cacophony. Unless we're talking about their Smash Ultimate renditions. Both are amazing, but in that case, Gangplank Galleon's the clear victor. Now you do get to have a rematch against him once you collect all the game's hidden Creme coins and complete the super challenging Lost World levels, and this rematch I did put on my previously mentioned worst final bosses list, but as I also previously mentioned, some elements of the video haven't quite held up. Sure, the rematch is quite a bit easier, but it's not without its challenge, and if anything, it's more of a final hurrah than a super hard final challenge. Rare really seems to like doing that between this and Diddy Kong Racing. So yeah, calling the rematch one of the worst final bosses was a bit much. That said, the first fight is still the better one, even if the rematch ends with this amusing sound effect. I am way too easily amused sometimes.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So for our next entry, we find ourselves back into the deep, deep pit that is Undertale. Seriously, it's been interesting seeing Undertale become quite the phenomenon it became, to the point that it got a chance to be represented in Smash Ultimate. Can't say many indie games have achieved that. But anyway, with the different take Undertale had on the classic turn-based RPG formula, between the whole mercy system and enemy attacks being minigames, it certainly left itself open for a lot of creative boss fights, something that it definitely delivers on. So with that said, deciding on which Undertale boss fight to go with was no easy feat. But at the end of the day, I decided to go with... I guess I'll talk about Undertale later. As you can tell from how I was rudely interrupted, Kid Icarus Uprising's take on Hades is quite the interesting one. While yes, it does follow the trope of depicting Hades as a villain, despite being one of the generally more decent gods in Greek mythology, the direction they take him is certainly different, and I mean that in the best way possible. He could have had a traditionally evil depiction, but instead, Uprising's Hades is more like an internet troll with the powers of a deity, going out of his way to get on everyone's nerves just for the fun of it. And hey, with him making his underworld army out of the souls of the dead, he's certainly not going to stop any of the other characters from fighting the wars they fight. But once the dust of the other plot lines settles, the big bad's gotta go down, so Pit goes off to do just that. In a full-blown mech. Interestingly, unlike most of the other bosses in the game, the fight against Hades is about 99% in the air battle format, and despite that, at no point does this battle start to feel stale. All throughout, Hades is changing up his method of attacks, and with the Great Sacred Treasure's ability to change form as it's damaged, your own artillery changes as the fight progresses, thus requiring you to constantly change your strategy as the fight plays out. And of course, with it being Kid Icarus Uprising, the battle's full of witty banter between Pit, Hades, and the other gods present.
Playing hard to get, are you? Good thing I've been training.
Kinda like watching an elephant sprint.
I was hoping to greet Kitty on top of a mountain of corpses, but I didn't even get a pile started with him hauling ideals. What a killjoy.
Your hunger for destruction is as boundless as it is callous, Hades.
Plus, a mountain of corpses? Seriously?
He's havoc from head to toe with weaponry, like a rainbow of apocalypse.
I prefer to think of it as my devastation ensemble. I only wear it for very special occasions. You know, weddings, Armageddons.
And it all culminates in Hades destroying the Great Sacred Treasure, Medusa showing up and punching Hades' head clean off, turning him into another familiar incarnation of Hades, leading into the final phase, dodging Hades' laser fire while Palutena charges up the Great Sacred Treasure's cannon, allowing Pit to blast Hades to smithereens. Or, as me in 2015 put it, let loose a shoop-de-whoop on him. Needless to say, it all makes for a standout way to wrap up Kid Icarus Uprising. And with it having been 9 years since the game came out, that means we're now 16 years away from that next game, going off what Hades says in the credits. Hopefully Sakurai's gotten a chance to take a vacation by then.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So now that that's all done, let's get back to talking about Undertale. And given the entry in question, throughout the game, you hear characters talk about the king of the monsters, Asgore Dreamer. And going off what everyone says about him, you expect him to be this monster to end all monsters, something to be truly terrified of. He's been collecting the souls of humans to break through the barrier into the human world, to wage war against mankind. In any other game, this character would be a true monster. But as you progress through the underground and eventually through his castle, you start to get exposed to the truth. The war he wishes to wage isn't unwarranted, wanting vengeance not just for his people being locked away underground by the humans, but for the death of his son Azriel, who had been wrongfully killed by humans when he managed to get through the barrier to bring his dead human friend home. And on top of that, it doesn't even sound like he wants to go through with this war, but more so has to now out of obligation. So with that, you start to feel a bit of sympathy for his cause. And then you meet him. This king that's been built up as a monster to end all monsters? In reality, he's a kind soul who's just watering his flowers when you first speak to him. When I first played Undertale, getting to this point hit me pretty hard. Having expected some big villainous character, I was caught completely off guard by how pleasant Asgore was. So you can only imagine how I felt when the fight against him actually started. For context, when I played through Undertale, I was doing a pacifist route, aiming to get the true pacifist ending. So you can imagine my shock when the very first thing he does in the fight is destroy the mercy option. This makes him the only traditional fight in the pacifist route that you have to actually fight, as much as you may not want to. But what's extra interesting about this is the why to him destroying the mercy option. On one hand, it could be interpreted as him not showing you any mercy. But on the other hand, and the way I see it, is that he believes he doesn't deserve any mercy after all the humans he's killed so far. And given how reluctant he's been to having to fight you so far, I think it's a safe presumption to make. And what a fight it is. Littering your movement space with projectiles, swinging at you with his trident in both blue and orange swipes. This does mean something mechanically for those who haven't played the game. He makes for a challenging fight. How I managed to beat him on my first try, I genuinely don't know. And it was 5 AM when I got to this fight. I guess I was just feeling extremely determined. Pun entirely intended. And then there's the boss theme. I already stated in my game soundtracks video with Silver that this is my favorite battle theme in the game, and yep, that still stands. It perfectly captures that melancholy feeling of having to fight a fight that neither of you really want to partake in, all with that special touch of leitmotif, something that the game's soundtrack as a whole excels in. Out of all the bosses in Undertale, Asgore definitely left the biggest mark on me. The way it brilliantly subverted my expectations, and turned what I was expecting to be this triumphant fight against a tyrannical king into a bittersweet duel against a broken soul who just wanted the best for his people. It's truly special.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So what do you say we keep this indie game train going? Though this time we're going to be heading to something a bit less emotionally driven. Well, actually, this game could be considered emotionally driven by the emotion of frustration, depending on who you ask. But the point is, let's talk about Cuphead. While I wasn't keeping a close eye on this one, like most were while it was in development, I very quickly fell in love with it once I played it. I've got a big love for traditional animation, so this hand-drawn animation in the style of old-school rubber hose cartoons is just mwah. I love it. And it certainly helps that the gameplay was super solid as well. Like with Shadow of the Colossus, Cuphead's gameplay is about 90% boss fights, and as such, there's a lot of great choices to pick from. Heck, it's hard to really say if there's a definitive best boss with this game. Most of them are solid, so it really comes down to personal preference with which boss you get the most out of, more so than a lot of other games. And in my case, I gotta go with... Okay, when I said I wanted to keep this indie game train going, I wasn't meaning literally. Being one of the last bosses in the game, the Phantom Express is certainly no slouch when it comes to difficulty. Like all the other bosses in the game, this fight's got itself many a phase. From fighting a blind ghost who can shoot eyeballs out of its hands, a giant skeleton conductor who can slam down his hands wherever his head isn't, 2 lollipop ghouls who can spew out lightning, and finally the trained engine, who gallops along and shoots out rings of bones and fireballs from his furnace, which also serves as his weak point. It's all a pretty exciting fight as is, with a lot of variety in what you take on, but the extra catch with this one is the ground you stand on. See, instead of being on stable ground, you stand on a platform that goes along with the train, and by parrying these vaults, you can position the platform between the 3 areas of play space. However, for most of the fight, items will drop down that, if they hit the vaults, will trigger them and move your platform. Thus, while fighting each of the enemies the train has to provide, you've also got to manage your platform's position and keep an eye out for items that could interfere with that, making for what could become quite a frantic fight. But personally at least, while certainly frantic, I find it all quite enjoyable. Also, I love the direction the boss theme goes. Like the rest of Cuphead's soundtrack, it's all jazz band, but with this piece, much of it is used to create a very train-like sound, between the trombones making the tooting of the train's horn, and the drums imitating the chugga-chugga of the wheels. Brilliant work on the composer's part. It really helps make this already great fight even greater.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
And on goes the indie train. And no, the next boss isn't train themed this time. Dust Elysian Tale. I went kinda quiet about this game in my videos after my rebranding, only to double down on it this year, between my review and featuring it in the game's soundtrack video. So I guess we're tripling down on it this year now. And yes, anyone who's seen that review knows exactly where this is going, but please, humor me for a moment. For as much as I adore this mostly one-man indie project, you know, favorite game and all, the boss fights are one of its weaker aspects. The characters you fight are great, the scenarios that result in these fights are great, the songs that play during these fights are great, but the fights themselves are pretty underwhelming all around. However, there is one case where all those previous factors are matched with a solid fight, and quite fortunately, it's the one that wraps up the game. For as much as the other bosses don't live up to the expectations set for them, the fight against General Gaius at the end of the game definitely does so. You spent the whole game hearing talk about this genocidal maniac, and while not interacting with him directly until the end, you've gotten to see firsthand just the kind of destruction and turmoil his campaign has caused, both directly and indirectly. And with the fate of the Moonblood race now in jeopardy, taking on Gaius himself was an inevitability, and he delivers on that build-up. With attacks similar to your own, such as his own sword combos and elemental magic, Gaius is a force to be reckoned with. But on top of that, the arena and fight dynamic is in constant shift with each phase, each one teetering on who's got the advantage. In the first phase, Gaius has you outnumbered with additional soldiers on flat ground. The second phase, you're on a bridge with floating platforms, with Moonbloods assisting you, but some of Gaius' airships also strike down from above. The third phase, Gaius once again has you outnumbered, but within the cavern are bomb plants that you can use against Gaius and his troops. And finally, you take on Gaius one-on-one on small platforms above molten lava. No clear advantages for one or the other. This is where it ends. The intense boss theme, fittingly titled, Let's End This, also suits the grandiose of the situation at hand. If you fall to Gaius now, the Moonbloods will be at his mercy, so you gotta give it your all. Couple that with the personal weight in this duel, given Dust and Gaius' past connections, and you've got yourself a solid conclusion to a wonderfully made indie classic. If any of you haven't bought and played this game, you really should. And if you have, well, buy it again. Be like me and own 4 separate copies of the game. I don't have a problem, what are you talking about?
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
You ever just fall in love with a boss fight from concept alone? Like you hear someone describe the basic premise of a boss battle and you immediately think, yes, I want this in my life? I haven't experienced it too much myself, as most bosses I've grown to love occurs because of the execution, but I can distinctly think of a boss where even before I fought it, I knew I was gonna love it. And it comes from a strange little game called Super Mario Sunshine, which is kind of funny because, speaking personally, boss fights aren't one of Mario Sunshine's strongest suits. Granted, one could say that about Mario games as a whole, but Sunshine especially didn't have a particularly strong lineup of bosses. And that's all before mentioning stuff like having to fight the polluted piranha no less than 5 times throughout the main game, or the infamous final Bowser battle. That said, there is one very big exception, and any longtime followers of my work know exactly where I'm going with this. The first time I fought Mecha Bowser, I immediately loved it before the fight even really got underway. Just, you're fighting a giant Bowser robot while riding a roller coaster. It's been a good decade and a half, at least, since I first played Sunshine, and I still can't get over how amazing that premise is. And it just so helps that it's a really fun fight. Shooting missiles collected on the roller coaster track over at Mecha Bowser, taking out rampaging bullet bills coming from both directions, dousing out Mecha Bowser's flames as you approach him, it's nothing short of exhilarating. It's also really interesting to note that, in the mainline console games at least, this is the first ever non-traditional boss in the series, as far as I recall. That is to say, you don't use the game's standard gameplay format to fight the boss. Mario was one of the few platformer franchises at the time that wasn't dabbling into alternate gameplay styles like others in the genre were. Each game usually just stuck to its core gameplay at all times, with minimal deviations. And even when they did deviate, it wouldn't be for boss fights. You were always your usual run-and-jumpy Mario doing run-and-jumpy things when taking on bosses. So it's fascinating that they decided to dip their toes into an alternate gameplay style for this boss fight, and they stuck the landing so well. Which, given the nature of Mario Sunshine at times, that's an impressive feat.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
As much as I have a deep enjoyment for final bosses, one must not underestimate the importance of the other end of the scale, the first boss. While final bosses are supposed to serve as a satisfying way to end a game, first bosses are supposed to serve as a way to hook the player, keep them wanting to play more of the fancy schmancy game you and your team have made. With that in mind, while you don't want to go absolutely nuts with your first boss, you still want to put in that effort to leave a lasting impression. Or you could be the Wonderful 101 and just go absolutely nuts with your first boss. Now granted, that's just the Wonderful 101 in nature. It's a pretty wild ride. Granted, I never got around to finishing this game before my family and I got rid of our Wii U, but from what I did play, the game's boss fights were consistently a highlight, with special mention going to, well, the game's first boss. With one of the Earth-protecting super reactors currently in the grasp of the beautifully hammy Lambo,
The cosplay brigade returns! Where did this child come from? Shenanigans!
the wonderful 100 are quick to pursue him, to which he pits the superhero team against his mighty beast, the Daiku Orochi. The start of the fight has you in control of the team's ship, taking shots at the creature as it flies throughout the city, but once you get a chance to get up on the Hydra's back, you enter standard Wonderful 101 gameplay. From there, you go to town on two of Orochi's heads, eventually taking control of one of them to completely decimate the other. And to think, things are far from their peak. Lambo's distracted, angry ranting gets everyone in a freefall, and now you've got a time limit to get to the goddess statue containing the super reactor before it hits the ground, all while throwing explosive canisters at Orochi to keep him away. And once on the goddess statue, you blast away Orochi's final head. But it's still not over. Now you take on Lambo more personally, clashing sword to sword and parrying Lambo's strikes. And once his health's down to 0, well, I'll just let the game speak for itself.
Unite, build! Unite, hand!
Quick reminder, this was all for the first boss. For most games, this kind of insane spectacle you'd expect for a near-end boss, if not the final boss. But leave it to Platinum Games to make their game's first boss have that same kind of love and give something really memorable. And while I didn't get to experience everything this game had to offer myself, I can still confirm for what I've seen. Some of the later bosses get even crazier. I think I ought to give this game another go. Good thing that remaster ended up happening last year.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
Having a bunch of fancy tools at your disposal, only to have them snatched away from you for you to regain later, can be quite annoying. But, over the years, I've come to realize that, depending on the context, these situations can actually be quite effective. For instance, taking away a specific ability or set of abilities temporarily for a specific challenge that would otherwise be a lot easier with those abilities. It can make for a good test of how well you can work without that crutch to fall back on. In an instance like that, they can make for strong gameplay moments. And a good example of this comes from a semi-recent indie classic, A Hat in Time. Now, I'll admit that I'm not quite as head over heels over Hat in Time as I was when I reviewed it back in the day, but it's overall still a great game. And one of its key strengths was the tools you had at your disposal and how they were used. In movement, of course, but more notably with the multiple hats and badges, the former giving you differing abilities, and the latter providing add-ons of sorts. For much of the game, you're probably going to rely on them quite a bit. So what happens when the game puts you in a situation where you can't use them? Well, there's actually more than one instance of this in the game, but easily the most memorable and effective is when fighting the Snatcher. Now, the Snatcher's already quite the character, one of the best in A Hat in Time to be more specific. Forcing you to sign over your soul to him, he gets you to perform a multitude of tasks within his haunted forest, from taking out a possessed outhouse, to infiltrating the mansion of his terrifying ex-lover, to delivering mail. Truly evil. But it's once you finish up your contract work that the Snatcher decides it's time for you to die, and upon facing him, well, he's called the Snatcher for a reason. You have access to none of your hats or badges during the fight, so you'll have to rely entirely on your basic moveset, which already adds a unique touch to the Snatcher's battle. But that's not all. See, in some of the other boss fights, when the boss was vulnerable to be hit, they'd turn blue. Snatcher, on the other hand,
Probably waiting for me to turn blue, aren't you? Sorry, kiddo. Blue doesn't suit me. And I guess that makes me invincible, huh? That's too bad.
So for a moment, you're left dodging his frantic attacks and wondering, how do I damage him? Well, it just so happens that the potions he sometimes throws are blue. I think you can connect the dots here.
Did you just color me blue with my own attack? This can't count, right? Surely this doesn't count.
But don't think him now being vulnerable will make him easier. If anything, he goes in even harder with his attacks, testing you on your maneuverability and taking your opportunities to strike. It makes for a really standout fight in this game. And to be fair, this game's got some pretty solid boss fights as a whole. And all this caps off with Hat Kid finding the perfect loophole to finally get Snatcher off her back. This child's a devious one, that's for sure.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So some of you might recall that about 4 years ago, my buddy Silver and I did a countdown on the best bosses in the Sonic series, which itself was a remake of a now non-existent video from 5 years before then. And for that countdown, we had the final battle against Dark Gaia from Sonic Unleashed at our #1 spot. Well, more specifically, the one from the Wii and PS2 version. Why the HD and SD versions had such different final bosses, I have absolutely no idea. But either way, as I noted, it's been 4 years since that video. So that's given me plenty of time to think over that choice and wonder if that really is my favorite Sonic boss. Spoiler alert, that opinion didn't change. Now yes, the SD version of Dark Gaia isn't quite as much of a visual spectacle compared to its HD counterpart. I will agree with that. That said, I do personally think the SD version makes for a much better fight from a gameplay standpoint. For instance, the first phase has you controlling the Gaia Colossus, taking on Dark Gaia via Punch-Out, dodging Dark Gaia's slashes and taking the opening opportunity to strike back, countering before he can really do a number on you. It all makes for a really satisfying way to kick things off. Or punch things off if you want to be technical. And then it's followed up with Sonic getting in on the action, taking you across the Gaia Colossus in the game's thrilling daytime stage-style gameplay. And sure, you've got yourself some QTEs required to land a blow on the beast, but hey, at least you're not destroying your controller like you do in the HD version's QTEs. But the best part they saved for last. Now as Super Sonic, you take on the evolved perfect Dark Gaia head-on, dodging his slashes that increase in speed and screen space, as well as his blasts of dark energy, all while zooming around to keep your ring counter up. And with that supersonic power, you blast your way through each of perfect Dark Gaia's eyes, all while avoiding meteors in the process. Again, say what you will about the HD version's final boss, I know it's got its fans, but speaking personally at least, I find the SD version way more engaging as a fight. And the use of the orchestral version of Endless Possibilities makes those strikes against perfect Dark Gaia's eyes all the more satisfying. Man, I miss this era of Sonic. Very hit and miss, sure, but man, did the hits hit hard.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So I generally don't remember if I've made this apparent in the past, but I've been a longtime fan of the superhero genre. Not to the extent that I need to consume anything and everything superhero related, but speaking generally, I've got a fondness for it. Growing up, I was more of a DC kid, but the one Marvel hero I was quite into as a kid was, no surprise, Spider-Man. Oh, actually, before I continue... Anyway, I also grew up having a strong love for villain characters, especially supervillains. Not much has changed in that regard. And in the case of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, my favorite has pretty much always been Dr. Octopus. Whether it's Alfred Molina's more sympathetic take in Sam Raimi's movies, or the timid Oscorp employee turned devious mastermind we got in Spectacular Spider-Man, or the brilliantly executed subversion we got in Into the Spider-Verse, just to name a few examples. I'm just really fond of this character. And one of my absolute favorite incarnations has to be Insomniac's take from the PS4 Spider-Man game. Being a mentor and employer to Peter Parker for a good chunk of the game, you get plenty of time to bond with this optimistic and kind-hearted iteration of Otto Octavius. And as you learn more about his falling out with his former friend and business partner Norman Osborn, who also actively tries to stomp out Otto's new company, as well as his own neurological disorder that'll eventually make him lose his motor functions, you grow pretty sympathetic to the guy and hope his advanced prosthetic research works out. But of course, if you're familiar with Otto's story in other media, you know things aren't gonna go well. And sure enough, in issue with his finalized robotic arms connection to his mind, combined with his growing hatred for Norman in light of recent events, pushes him past his breaking point. It's then that Otto becomes Dr. Octopus, freeing several supervillains from prison and releasing the Devil's Breath, a very dangerous serum that testing of led to fatalities and Otto cutting ties with Norman in the first place, into the city, all as part of his plan to destroy Norman's reputation. Well, Peter wasn't going to have any of that, so he took to fighting the Sinister Six that Doc Ock formed, taking them all down before confronting his former former friend. So going into this final battle, the tensions are already pretty high. Otto understandably wants Norman brought to justice, but the extremes he's resorted to has put lives on the line, including Peter's own loved ones. So both combatants are giving it their all, and with those robotic arms, Doc Ock can be a force to be reckoned with a variety of maneuverability options and long-range attacks, including ripping up debris from the arena and tossing it at you. Even with your own tools, he doesn't go down easy, so you'll want to use that Spidey sense counter to its fullest when you can and gradually make him vulnerable. But that's just part one of the fight, and it's in the interlude cutscene that the real bombshell is dropped.
Such a disappointment. Parker. You knew? I tried to warn you, Peter, but you didn't listen. You knew.
And here's where things go from great to really great. While the gameplay of the second phase is a fair bit simpler, mostly consisting of dodging Doc Ock's blows and taking the opportunity to strike with melee attacks, it's everything else that amplifies it all. The music, the set piece of fighting on the side of the building, the heightened personal stakes of both Peter and Otto, it's all incredibly intense and incredibly effective. And this is amplified even further by the fight's cinematic conclusion and the cutscene that follows. I won't spoil how it plays out, but man, this scene dealt an emotional sucker punch to me when I first played the game. Insomniac's Spider-Man game as a whole was brilliantly put together by a team of people who clearly loved the IP mythos and wanted to tell their own engaging take on it. And man, did they deliver as a whole. And their take on my favorite Spider-Man villain and the battle that accompanied him was the delicious icing on the cake. You can bet I'm excited for what they have in store for Spider-Man 2.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
Given the recent memes regarding this character, I think there's only one way I can open this segment.
We're here to kill chaos.
Yep, even after all these years, Chaos from Dissidio reigns supreme as my favorite Final Fantasy boss. Also known as the God of Discord, Chaos serves as the main villain of the original games, commanding the army of Final Fantasy villains against the Goddess of Harmony Cosmos and her forces of Final Fantasy heroes. Well, commanding is a bit of an overstatement, as Chaos is pretty passive as a leader, kinda just letting his troops do their own thing and plot their own schemes. Despite this, Chaos is nothing short of imposing when he does get into action. From his towering build, to his chilling voice, to being able to utterly obliterate Cosmos with a single strike. Granted, this was largely possible due to Cosmos being in a weaker state from giving her power to her warriors so they could defeat Chaos for good and end the cycle, but still. With all that said, how's about we talk about the battle itself? The fight plays out across 3 phases, with Chaos gaining new attacks in each phase. Gameplay-wise, he functions as any other opponent in the game, using the same bravery and HP attack system that you do, but Chaos has a few things in his favor. For one, look at him. He towers over everyone in the roster. Sure, it makes him a bigger target, but it also makes his own attacks more devastating and harder to avoid, especially given the small arena you fight him in. Additionally, he has himself the Summon Stone for Shinryu, and unlike most summons that can be only used once, he can use Shinryu multiple times throughout all 3 phases. And with Shinryu having multiple potential effects, he can easily push the battle in his favor at any moment. And by the 3rd phase, he gets access to his own EX Burst, where he increases in size and goes to town on you with his massive sword, all leading into his final attack, one that'll do considerable damage if you're caught in the blast. It's by no means an easy fight, especially since your health isn't restored in between phases, so any HP attack he successfully lands can easily put you into a danger zone. But that said, it is so satisfying to evade those attacks and take the opportunity to strike. It helps that Dissidia as a whole has a really fun combat system. It makes for an incredibly rewarding fight. And then he got a new super boss form in Dissidia Duodecim and proceeded to destroy tons of players.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
Given I recently did a top 15 on the bosses of this specific series, I think this next choice should be a pretty obvious one for some of you. But for those who haven't seen the video I'm hinting at, Crash Bandicoot 4 is an interesting case. In the years since its release, it's got itself a bit of a mixed following from fans, with some calling it the best game in the series, and others calling it a massive disappointment, if not outright bad. I'm not in either camp myself, but I lean more towards the former. It certainly got itself some notable faults, but I did enjoy my time with Crash 4 quite a bit. And one part that I absolutely loved about the game was the finale. Granted, the plotline I had to cut short to allow this to happen was an unfortunate sacrifice, especially with how lackluster the fight that wrapped up said plotline was, but the idea of Cortex going back in time to prevent his past self from ever making Crash was one I was totally behind. As I said in my top 15 Crash bosses video, I used to imagine different scenarios when I was younger for the Crash cast, and Cortex going back to Crash 1 times was one I especially liked thinking about. So seeing it actually happen in Crash 4 got me super excited. And I was already beyond satisfied with how they treated this scenario by the time I got to the final boss. But then the game took those extra few steps to make this finale special. Throughout the game, you've used the quantum mask powers against all the main bosses, culminating in using all of them for the fight against Entropy and Femtropy. So where do you go from there? Quite simple. Let the boss use them. Throughout the fight, Cortex will manipulate the quantum mask's powers against you, testing you on each one's utility in a very different way than before, which is really creative for a Crash boss. And it helps that the rest of the fight is solid as well, with lasers and lab assistance and shifting platforms, and all this is accompanied by a brilliantly crafted boss theme that mixes together the main theme of Crash 1 with Cortex's iconic Crash 3 boss theme. Again, Crash 4's got itself some notable faults, but its strengths are incredibly strong, and this fight in particular made for an incredibly satisfying way to wrap up this first brand new game in the series in over a decade. One that I would advise getting either used or from a friend if you want to try it out yourself, given everything that's been going on with Activision Blizzard lately. Really hoping those lawsuits work out for the better.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to drain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
If you haven't been able to tell from some of the entries on this list, I've got a real big love for indie games. With the big budget side of the game industry moving pretty constantly towards stuff with heavy monetization and emphasizing hyperrealism, something I'm personally not as wowed by, the indie scene has been great in providing a fair bit more variety, and often giving us more out there kinds of games. And as someone who grew up with a lot more out there kinds of games, I'm not complaining. Not to say the indie scene's immune to faults like heavy monetization, but yeah. There's a lot of indie games I could talk about for hours, some of which are already appearing on this list, but there's one that I've been wanting to talk about since I first played it, but felt I couldn't necessarily do it justice in review form, and that game is Celeste. With that said, I was a bit late to the Celeste train, but man, I grew to really like this game really quickly. And part of what had me hooked was the story and characters. To those who are unaware, Celeste centers on Madeline, a girl who simply wants to climb to the summit of Celeste Mountain. And it proves to be a difficult challenge, both from a gameplay perspective and from a personal perspective. See, Madeline deals with anxiety and depression, and this is her driving motive to make it to the summit. She wants to challenge herself and successfully overcome that challenge. But her insecurities about the dangerous journey end up magically manifesting in a physical form, referred to by fans and the developers as Battlein. Clever. Battlein serves as the game's antagonist for a majority of the run, constantly trying to hinder Madeline's progress up the mountain and convince her to give up and go home. Despite this, Madeline is persistent, and she finally decides to confront Battlein and tell her that she's no longer needed, that Madeline's stronger without her. It doesn't go too well. In one fell swoop, Battlein drags Madeline back to the bottom of the mountain to try and break her resolve once and for all. However, it's through the aftermath that Madeline realizes that, instead of pushing this part of herself away, it may be more beneficial to try and talk it out, and work together to get up the mountain. Battlein's not too interested though. So there's a lot of reasons why I love the fight against Battlein, beyond just the story and character aspects. For one, the dynamic. In previous encounters with Battlein, she was always pursuing you, trying to stop you dead in your tracks. But this time, the tables have turned. With each hit, Battlein dashes off to try and get away from you. But she's certainly not helpless in this scenario, having laser fire and laser balls at her disposal to try and blast you, on top of being able to manipulate the various environments in different ways. You need to be on your toes at all times with this one, but in true Celeste fashion, checkpoints are aplenty and respawning is almost instant, so deaths are never too frustrating. It made for an incredibly thrilling battle, even if I was getting my butt kicked over and over again, also in true Celeste fashion. And it's all capped off with a great moment, in which Madeline and Battlein make up and become one, unlocking the double dash, and leading into the game's final chapter. Well, final main chapter. Point is, Celeste is a very good game, and you should play it if you haven't.
Trying to reach inside of me, trying to gain my energy. Let me show you just what I'm made of.
So admittedly, deciding my number one was very difficult to do. Literally during the writing phase, I still wasn't sure which boss I was going to put at number one. But then, I experienced something. Something I've been wanting for a very long time. And the moment I did, picking my number 1 was very, very easy. With that said, let's jump over into the world of Devil May Cry. I got into the Devil May Cry series a bit later than most, first playing DMC3 and DMC4 back in 2015, while the series was still in a state of uncertainty. DMC4, the most recent game in the main series, was 7 years old, and the most recent DMC game in general was, well, the failed attempt at a Western-appealing reboot. The point is, I had become familiar enough with DMC just in time for that E3 2018 reveal of Devil May Cry 5, returning to the series' roots with Nero and OG Dante serving as the main characters again. Needless to say, I was among those excited for the game, and it certainly didn't disappoint. The game was practically a massive love letter to the franchise's legacy, while still being a super solid standalone game, easily the best in the series in my opinion. And hey, with the game celebrating several aspects of the classic games, it only made sense that for the final battle, they'd go back to easily the most iconic boss in the franchise, the ever so motivated Virgil. But don't think for a moment that the game holds up this boss fight with nostalgia and nostalgia alone. Virgil is a very satisfying final boss from a gameplay standpoint, and originally was my choice for this list, but only would have been at number 2. And then I experienced something else. In true Devil May Cry fashion, a special edition for DMC5 was released the following year, conveniently lining up with the releases of the PS5 and Xbox Series X. And, also in true Devil May Cry fashion, one of the main features of DMC5 Special Edition was the addition of Virgil as a playable character, putting all his abilities from his boss fight in your hands. And sure, he goes through the same missions from the main campaign, but he's incredibly fun to play as, so it works out. But that said, when Special Edition was first announced, it did have me wonder, what were they going to do for the final battle? In DMC3 Special Edition, for the Dante vs. Virgil fights, Virgil would simply go up against a Virgil recolor. Sure, it quote-unquote looked the part of Dante, but you weren't really fighting him. And understandably, I and others were wondering if they were just going to do that again, or if they were going to make Dante a full-on boss character this time. It was the latter. And man, did they deliver! Dante's moveset has translated perfectly into this boss variant, now having you go up against the walking arsenal you got to play as in the main campaign, right down to even being able to switch between styles. Though for much of the fight, Dante is going to be relying primarily on the Royal Guard style. And between this and Royal Guard being a good means to cheese the Virgil fight in the main game, I'm now convinced that Virgil hears Dante shouting Royal Guard in his nightmares. And while it would have been interesting to see Virgil take on a boss variant of Nero, Special Edition instead doubles down on the fight between Virgil and Dante, providing a second phase where Dante uses everything he's got, including his Sin Devil trigger form. And the icing on the massive, massive cake? Virgil's main battle theme, Bury the Light, plays in its entirety during the second phase, which is just, it's so good! I'm not even the slightest bit disappointed that Nero doesn't get to shine as a boss. Special Edition goes above and beyond to finally give us a proper Dante vs. Virgil fight from Virgil's perspective. And it is wonderful, it is amazing, it is easily my favorite boss battle. Capcom, you never cease to satisfy. And that marks the end of this presumably very big video. I know I probably could have done something a bit more personal or relating to the channel itself for the 10th anniversary, but hey, like I implied earlier, boss fight lists were kind of a staple on my channel for a while. Anyway, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for sticking around and watching these silly videos of mine. Whether you're newer to my work or you've been around since those days of old, I appreciate all of you, truly. Now admittedly, I don't know how much longer I'll be doing videos, as there are other endeavors that I'd like to sink my teeth into eventually, but however long I keep going, I intend on doing what I can to keep you all entertained, so I hope you continue to enjoy what I put out. With that said, this has been Black Mage Benjamin, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody.